now it's time to review a ship that almost all of you have seen. This ship, which is the one that fronts the dry dock, is the good old pre-dreadnought USS Oregon. She was an Indiana-class battleship, which was a key marker in the progress of the US Navy. Prior to this, the US Navy had made do with an increasingly geriatric collection of Civil War-era designs for a questionable amount of home defence. Eventually, this run ended with the construction of the USS Maine, which was nonetheless not a true battleship and is often listed as an armoured cruiser. This was followed by USS Texas, which was just about a battleship but decidedly a small second-class coast defence unit. The US Navy would now change gear yet again, determining a new naval policy that had massive scope, calling for a fleet of 10 ocean-going and no less than 25 short-range coastal defence battleships. A sword and shield approach weighted quite heavily towards the shield. The coastal defence vessels were planned at 3 separate levels of capability, lighter units being designed for riverine and littoral combat, whilst larger units would be able to stand alongside the ocean-going vessels against a potentially hostile battle fleet. Congress, however, had other plans for the precious dollars, and after several rounds of compromise, the initial approval for a reduced program came through with funding for 3 of the largest class of coastal defence battleship. In part, this was agreed by taking most of the remaining monitors and gifting them to the seagoing version of the National Guard, theoretically reducing the ship count and running costs of the actual US Navy. In keeping with Congress's idea of a balanced navy, which would continue for the next couple of decades, the funding for the battleships would also allow for, count it, a single light cruiser and 1 whole torpedo boat. As designed, the ships were to displace a mere 8,000 tons, but carry a main battery of 4 13-inch guns in a pair of twin turrets, one fore and one aft, as well as an extensive battery of 5-inch guns with 17 inches of Harvey steel belt armour. However, various changes in the design eventually resulted in a ship that displaced just over 10,000 tons, and whilst it carried the designed main battery, the secondary battery now consisted of 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 per side, along with 4 casement-mounted 6-inch guns, a battery of 20 single 57mm guns, along with 6 37mm guns, and a number of just above water torpedo tubes positioned fore, aft and amidships. And who says the French were not onto something? Final belt armour thickness came in at 18 inches and speed was 15 knots, driven by 2 screws that used between 9 and 11,000 shaft horsepower. This gave the US Navy ships which, on paper, could go toe-to-toe with any battleship in any navy in the world at the time, assuming that they were kind enough to come to the US, since being coastal defence ships, their range was somewhat limited. Unfortunately, their relatively small size meant that this capability was far more theoretical than practical, especially since stabilising bilge keels, intended to counter some of the problems, had been eliminated during the design as a cost-saving measure during construction. This led to rather immediate problems, as the main turrets, which carried guns typically found on ships about 50% greater in displacement, were not actually centrally balanced, as this would have required the turrets to be even larger, too large to fit, in order to get a central balance point. Thus, the guns had to be locked in place with clamps whilst they were underway, otherwise they had a distressing tendency to swing backwards and forwards with the roll of the ship. But as it turned out, their weight was so great that the clamps simply broke in bad weather, with each swing causing a dangerous pendulum list motion to build, which rather understandably threatened the ship's stability. The bilge keels were then retroactively installed, but the turrets would continue to cause issues as, even with the keels fitted, training both turrets out to one side, like say in the direction of an enemy, would make the ships heel in that direction, which lowered the maximum true elevation angle and shortened the gun's range, as well as submerging the main belt so that incoming shells would hit the unarmoured upper section of the hull on that side, as well as exposing the unprotected underside of the ship to anyone who happened to be on the other side of the vessel. Eventually, counterweights were added, but this was only a partial solution, as this increased the draft of the ships so much that the belt ended up submerged anyway. Again, due to their small size, there wasn't much unoccupied real estate on the ship, and this limited the true firing arc of the 13-inch and 8-inch main guns, lest the blast effects destroy other parts of the ship and injure or kill nearby crew. This was in part remedied in a later refit by removing the 6-inch guns and many of the smaller weapons, which eliminated many of the at-risk positions and thus widened the fields of fire for the larger guns, with a secondary effect of somewhat countering the increased displacement from the main gun counterweights and bringing some of the armour belt back above the waterline. Albeit that the subsequent installation of a dozen 3-inch guns to restore a tertiary battery of some sort increased displacement and draft again, undoing much of the good work that had been done previously. The torpedo tubes were their own particular tale of woe. Being above water, they were not fully sealed units, but being so close to the waterline, they ended up shipping in large amounts of water if they were opened when the ship was underway, and they were in a prime location to be hit by an incoming shell. These would be reduced and then eventually eliminated over the first decade or so of service. 3 ships would be laid down: Indiana, Massachusetts, and Oregon, all being laid down in 1891, launched in 1893, and Indiana would commission in 1895, with the other 2 coming into service in 1896. Indiana and Massachusetts would both be part of the flying squadron involved in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba in the Spanish-American War, but both would miss the main battle, in the former case due to speed being relatively low, and in the latter case due to not being with the formation on the day. But both would take part in secondary engagements in the aftermath. After the war, both ships would become training ships before being decommissioned before World War I as obsolete, and then periodically brought back for use as training and accommodation ships. Indiana would be used for explosives tests and scrapped in the 1920s, whilst Massachusetts was partially sunk for use as an artillery target in the same period, eventually decaying into an artificial reef that can still be visited today. Oregon's history was a little bit more colourful, and so this particular guide is going to run into a bit of overtime. Oregon found itself in dry dock in the run-up to the Spanish-American War, but with the loss of USS Maine, she was put back into service rather quickly and ordered from the Pacific to the Atlantic. A much more arduous task than these days, as it was pre-Panama Canal, thus requiring a voyage of over 2 months circumnavigating the entirety of South America, which included a storm so violent she actually had to anchor herself to ride it out. After a brief phantom torpedo boat incident, this one appropriately Spanish, she joined the rest of the US's main Atlantic forces and was then redeployed to Santiago de Cuba once the Spanish ships had been located there. Due to a series of unfortunate events, all of the larger American ships except for Oregon were not in a position to pursue immediately, which put her in the lead, followed closely by the cruiser USS Brooklyn, which was doing the warship equivalent of high-speed hopping on half of her engines. Thus, Oregon liberally distributed high-explosive freedom amongst the Spanish flotilla, including what was basically a one-hit KO when a main battery shell punched a huge hole in the destroyer Pluton. After the last Spanish ship surrendered, Oregon hove to and began inspecting her damage. This turned out to be relatively short work, as it turned out that aside from sea spray and the odd fish fragment, she hadn't actually taken any hits. With the war over, shortly thereafter, Oregon went in for maintenance before being assigned to the Asiatic Squadron on the other side of the Pacific. Just in time for the Philippine-American War, as in true 19th century colonial fashion, Spain had ceded the country to the USA at the end of the Spanish-American War, but the locals had taken more than a little bit of an objection to the situation. The century turned, and Oregon headed over to visit other Western Pacific countries, only to hear about the Boxer Rebellion in China. However, her chance to score a hat-trick of wars was ruined by hitting an uncharted rock on her way to the Allied fleet, and after a week of reflotation efforts, she had to head back to Japan for repairs. The next 6 years was a relatively quiet period, returning to the USA for the occasional refit, but otherwise meandering around the Pacific and Indian Oceans, showing the flag and maintaining US interests, before being decommissioned in 1906 to make her crew available for new ships. During this period, she would receive most of the refits described earlier to her armament, before returning to service in 1911 for a couple of years, before heading back into reserve. Here she would stay until the US entered World War I in 1917, when she would be brought back into service again, this time for use as a troop ship escort, since her viability as a battlefield unit was long past, but she was still infinitely more deadly than any known raider. She would therefore last long enough, post-war, to receive the new designation BB-3, and efforts were made to keep her as a museum ship. But with the Washington Naval Treaty and subsequent cuts in funding, she was demilitarized first, before Oregon was allowed to have what was left of the ship on loan. This would last until the US entered World War II, when the US Navy determined to scrap what was left and use the funds for the war effort. However, it was then decided to use her as a store ship, or similar, in the invasion of Guam, and so the mostly emptied hulk was packed full of ammunition and duly dispatched to the invasion fleet. Invasion completed, the poor old ship, or what was left of her by this point, was left behind, and so she decided to sneak away for some high seas adventures, making a bid for freedom in a November typhoon in 1948. A full-scale search effort eventually found her making a beeline for that magical place, Tahiti, and she was hauled back into her position until 1956, when she was sold for scrap.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.